Welcome to All About Capital Campaigns, a podcast that provides fuel for your nonprofit's growth. Each week, hosts Andrea and Amy Eisenstein, co-founders of the Capital Campaign Toolkit, provide practical tips about raising more money for your nonprofit organization. The Capital Campaign Toolkit is a support system for nonprofit leaders who are running capital campaigns. At capitalcampaigntoolkit.com, you can download a step-by-step guide for your capital campaign and get many other free resources. This podcast is recorded on a live webinar every Monday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. You can join the live session and get your questions answered by signing up today at toolkittalks.com.
Today, we're going to be talking about boards and capital campaigns. What's the specific topic today?
Yeah, so we're starting by thinking about asking your board members for money. I mean, that's always a little dicey, right? There are a number of dicey things around it. So it's, I think, an interesting and important topic, and it applies both to capital campaigns and with your annual fundraising, of course, because your board members should be giving to both of those. And there are a variety of topics that come from that, but let me talk about the one that's first on my mind, which is to ask the question of whose job is it anyway to ask board members for money? Right. I think often staff members feel like they should take care of that. But of course, it feels sort of icky for staff members to be asking board members for money. That feels like it's not the appropriate positioning of staff to board. Right. It doesn't. So it's much better, really, if you can get board members to deal with policies around board giving and actually making the board giving happen, helping to set the board giving goals, right? It just, as an executive director, it's awkward to do that, isn't it?
Right.
Amy?
The board is technically the executive director's boss, and they're being paid. So it's hard for the executive director then to go out and solicit the board.
Harder. Right,
yeah.
Right.
And it's always better if it comes from board member to board member. So what are you recommending?
Well, I mean, what I'm recommending is that the board chair should be leading the way towards the process of developing policies and soliciting the board's board. Now, if you don't have a board chair that's willing to do that, then I suppose it falls down to the development committee chair. But it's much better if the board chair takes it over. And I think it is possible for the executive director or development director to talk to the board chair about his or her responsibility in that capacity. And ideally, that should be written into the board chair's job description so that they know going in that one of the things they have to do is to handle the solicitation and the processes around asking board members to make their gifts.
So here's the challenge when it comes to board asking and giving. There's many challenges, actually, but the one that was on the top of my mind is that when you have a board chair who is uncomfortable with that position and doesn't want to do that, ultimately what happens is that they just announce in a board meeting that everybody should give, and they pass out maybe pledge forms. And as you know, if you've been visiting with me and Andrea over the last months and years, or you have your own experience, that is not the most effective way to solicit anybody, but definitely not board members. So you really want to do it in a one-on-one way. The board chair, the board president, or the development committee chair should be sitting down with each and every board member annually to talk about their roles and responsibilities on the board, what their gift is going to be, a company match, all sorts of issues. And you can have it as part of a larger board responsibility conversation. It doesn't just have to be about the ask, but really, ideally, and, we're going to give you best practices, and then we can talk about the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation may be that your board chair is not the best person qualified or willing or able for whatever reason to go out and ask. And then Hopefully another board member can pick up the reins, or sometimes it just does fall to the executive director. Hopefully it doesn't fall all the way to the development director, but the reality is that your board needs to be asked whether you're in a campaign or not. They need to be asked annually for their gift and for their commitments, what they're going to be doing for your organization. And so it's important that somebody at your organization is equipped to have those conversations.
You know, our colleague, I've had a number of conversations with our colleague, Ken Stroman, recently about this subject. And one of the things he said that just made me laugh, and it's so true, he said, you know, when you give to something, it actually changes your relationship to that something. He said he lives in Oklahoma, is that right?
Yeah.
He lives in Oklahoma. He lives in oil territory. He said, you know, if I buy a few shares of a particular oil stock, he said, I find myself going to the gas stations of that oil company. That's a really great example.
That's funny.
That once you've invested in something, you tend to become more aware of it. You tend to do more for it. It tends to draw you towards it. And I think that's the same thing that happens when board members give in a serious way. So I think we can't underestimate it, not just because of the money that's represented, and sometimes that's significant, but also because of what it does to cementing the relationship between the board members and the institution.
Right. There is something to the idea that once you invest in something, you are more invested in it, you know, more than just the money. It engages you in a different level. You're more committed once you've invested money. And so, you know, the cycle goes round and round. And I think that it is a huge mistake for organizations just to announce at a board meeting, we need all board members to give, right? It leaves a ton of money and resources and commitment on the table. And it doesn't engage people in the ways that they should be involved and engaged when, especially when you're having a campaign, but years before you have a campaign.
Right. You know, Kent also said something else that really I thought was so right. He said, you know, there are two ways to get 100% participation, right? And they both require a signature. He said, one signature is a signature on a pledge form. The other signature is a signature on a resignation form. I thought, well, that's right. If you have a board member who really isn't willing to make a contribution, who isn't willing to take on that level of commitment to your organization, you really don't want them on your board. They do nothing but sap and drain energy and set a negative example. So if somebody's not willing, you might want to talk to them about whether they are helping the organization in the best of ways. Maybe they would resign from the board and help in another way. But I thought that story of Kent is like, okay, both require a signature, one for a pledge form, one for a resignation form. And that's a great way to get to 100% participation.
Yeah, it's memorable, isn't it? Memorable. You're not going to forget it. Right. All right, let's look at some of these questions. I have ideas churning about that, but some of them have vanished from my mind at the moment. Let's turn to our questions. So, Amy, I see you've asked a question and then two people have tacked onto it. So it must be a good question. Amy is writing, any best practices for year-end appeal letters following a capital campaign? The appeal is not supporting the same project, but do we reference it? We're going to both nod. Yes. Okay, Andrea, you start, and I'm going to read some of the follow-up questions.
Well, I'll give you the typical, the sort of the standard answer to that is the double ask, double mention, double ask. That's what we have called it for years and years and years. I learned that from an old codger in the field when I was a young whippersnapper. And he said the issue of annual giving and board and campaign giving is best represented by double mention, double ask. What do we mean by that? It means that if you are in a campaign and you know you're going to be asking for a campaign gift, but you're going to ask for an annual gift first, you mention that you're going to be coming back to ask for a campaign gift. And if you're asking for a campaign gift and someone has already made an annual fund gift, you mention how generous it is that they have made the annual fund gift and now you're asking for the campaign gift. Or if you're asking for the campaign gift and you're going to be coming back to them with an annual fund gift, the notion is transparency, right? You don't have to ask for the gifts at the same time, but you do need to reference them going either way. And this double mention, double ask again is a nice, simple, memorable way to keep in mind that you don't want to surprise anybody. You don't want to pretend that you're not coming back. You want to be able to put this on the table in a clear and straightforward way.
All right.
Sometimes that's asking for two gifts in the same meeting.
All right. So Amy's clarifying here. Their campaign has wrapped up. So now it's an annual appeal following the campaign. So the appeal isn't supporting the same project, but honestly, I hope it is. Your annual fund evermore after a campaign should be supporting. The campaign helps your organization grow and get to the next level. So in theory, maybe not specifically in every case, but in theory, your annual fund following a campaign would be supporting the expansion of your projects and services. But of course, you will mention the projects and services, the new expansion, whatever you're doing and whatever you were able to do that year probably has something to do with what you were able to accomplish with the capital campaign. So I don't know why you wouldn't mention it.
But let's be clear, right? That typically the difference between annual giving and campaign giving is that for annual giving, you are in one way or another supporting your operating budget. And the anticipation is that the donor will give year after year after year. Now you might slant it differently to focus on special things your organization is doing that year. But when you go to someone for a campaign ask, you are asking for something special over and above your general operating expenses. So that's the difference between them. And it will always be the difference between them. Right? It's the difference between recurring giving and special giving, right? You're going to the same people, but you're asking them to consider giving out of two different pockets of money. And you're asking them to give for two different things. One are the recurring expenses of the organization, and the other are the special expenses that move the organization forward.
Excellent. All right. Renata?
I would say Renata. Do we have that right?
There's no A on the end.
But there is an E, which is Renata.
Okay. All right. Do you always need to include a board member in a big ask for the capital campaign? So I think the question is, does a board member need to be there to help with the ask? Right? Is that how you're reading that question?
Yeah, that is how I'm reading it.
So always is a loaded word, right? Always, never. It's great when you have a board member there, especially when they have a relationship with that donor. I would say that it's not a big ask is never a time to introduce somebody new, right? You want to have, if the donor has met the board member on multiple occasions or knows the board member, sure, then it's powerful. But do you always need to include one? It doesn't always work out that way. A board member is not always available. They're not always willing. They're not always good at asking. So in those cases, you probably wouldn't include one. Want to add anything?
No, I think that's right. I think there's really never and always.
Right.
Right. And I think that it depends on the person you're talking to and who has the relationship with the person you're talking to. Mm-hmm. My own preference is that if you have someone who is comfortable with asking and does a good job, one-on-one is often better than two-on-one. Now, not everyone agrees with me, I should say. That's a negotiable subject. Mm. But I always worry about having more solicitors than donors in the room because everyone ends up talking too much. The solicitors end up talking too much because you got two mouths instead of one, right? So my own preference is to make the solicitation as simple as possible, so that the focus can be on what it is you're asking them for and what's happening in the organization and the power and interest and passion of the donor, rather than the solicitors having so much to say.
Yeah. You want to make sure that when you do bring board members and any staff members that are along for the ride, they know that their important job is to ask the donors questions, right? And that's how you can get a board member who maybe is too chatty or likes to hear themselves talk a little bit too much, say, your main role is to ask these 2 questions or these 3 questions. And really, we need to do a great job listening to the answer and making sure that the donor's on the same page with us.
Let's go to Dana's question, which picks up from what we were talking about before. She says, preceding a capital campaign, best practices for year-end appeal letters before your organization launches a campaign. So one of the approaches for that is to do a year-end solicitation and say, you'll be excited to know that we are planning a new facility. And in the next year, we will be launching a capital campaign, right? And this may take a while, but here's what's going on. We will be excited to come back to you in the new year and tell you more about that.
Yeah, stay tuned. A stay tuned kind of message, right?
Yeah,
all right. Excellent. And I think this one was a tack on as well. So Carol's asking also, what are the best practices for integrating operating endowment and upgrades of staff salaries? To at least
parity or better. So let's see.
Was that an annual appeal question? All right. Best practices for integrating operating endowment.
Right. So, okay, operating endowment, let's talk about that first. So you all know that the most effective way to build your endowment is through plan giving. And you probably know that plan giving takes a lot of steady little drips, right? You need to constantly be mentioning it. Why? Because people don't make and remake their wills every day, or even every year, or even every decade, right? You remake your will typically when something happens in your life, when your daughter gets married or has a baby or someone dies or who knows what triggers to redo your will. When someone is redoing your will, you do want to be in their minds so that they might include you. Now, there are simpler ways that they can include you, but you want that these are not decisions people make like they make annual fund gifts. So I think with many of your annual fund letters, you can say, would you like to include us in your will? Let us know if you'd like to join their bequest society or whatever. I mean, so just keep nudging that little by little by little. And it takes a lot of it over a long time, but gradually it does pay off and work. Upgrading staff salaries to parity, that's that to me is a question of looking at your annual operating budget and deciding that you're gradually going to raise more money every year so that you can support that. I mean, that's not rocket science to figure out.
Yeah. I mean, Carol, I think you're trying to tack that onto an annual fund question. And sure, your annual, maybe a mailing. Of course, the goal is to raise more money each year. But to me, the real way to significantly increase your budget is not through direct mail. It's through major gift asks. And so it's about finding your 20 best potential donors and sitting down with them and saying, listen, we want to make sure that our staff is paid well enough that we can keep them, we can train them, they stay with us, and we want to make sure that we're paying them well, that they're not going to leave next year, and that we need to, be a great place to work. So anyways, of course it's through your direct mail. If you can do the annual fund it should include major gifts and individual solicitations. I don't know if that answers your question, but in terms of endowment, it's your plan giving program. It's your bequest program. So every time you send a mailing and every time you ask someone in person, say, listen, have you ever considered including us in your will? That's how we're going to grow our endowment. Is that something you'd be willing to discuss? And see who's receptive.
So I want to go to Paula and then to Chuck's question.
Yeah. Right? All right, good.
Paula put it in first. So Paula, you deserve some attention. And she wants tips for integrating a milestone anniversary with a capital campaign. And I'm so glad you've asked this. We get many, many organizations that come to us and say, our organization is going to be 20 years old in 2 years, in 2023. And we want to have a capital campaign to raise $20 million to celebrate our 20th anniversary. or something like that. And of course, we always roll our eyes at that, right? It's not polite to roll your eyes, but most people can't see us. So it does make us roll our eyes because honestly, with the exception of your founder and perhaps your executive director, nobody really cares that your organization is going to be 20 years old. What they care about is what you've accomplished in those 20 years and what you're going to accomplish going forward. So the reason for anniversaries, the reason to celebrate anniversaries is because you can use them as a jumping off point to say, here's what we've accomplished. And now we're doing a plan that's going to help us really ramp up. And we're going to raise money around that ramp up, not around our milestone.
Right.
Now,
So, okay, go ahead. Right. An anniversary, I always talk about an anniversary as backward looking, right? It shows that you have a track record. It shows your accomplishments, but fundraising and campaigns specifically are forward looking. It's about what are you going to be doing in the future? So while it's nice to have a track record and it's wonderful for people to be able to trust your organization has been in the community for 20 years or 50 years, that's not why they're going to give more money. They're going to give more money because of what you're going to be doing in the next 10 years. So, of course, you can incorporate some anniversary celebrations and celebrate what you've accomplished, but really a campaign is about what the vision is, what you will accomplish.
So we have a couple of people I think have posted questions in the chat. It is helpful to us if you put those in the Q&A where we see them more easily. But let's hop over to Chuck. We have a number of board members who sponsor events, who also sponsor events at our conference or various other needs. The executive director is very good at soliciting those gifts. And Chuck is wondering, Chuck, you're the board chair. Thank you for being here. Wondering about the board chair and the executive director stepping on each other's toes in those asks. And that's a great question. I mean, many of these questions are great questions, I have to say. This one is one that I don't think we've discussed before. And I personally like the idea of having a donor portfolio. I was actually just working with my Providence client on that. They send me a copy of something they put together where you actually on one page, you pretend as though their giving is an investment portfolio. Right. And you actually map out. I mean, what they said at the top is we appreciated at the top of this one page investment portfolio they put together for each of their major donors. They began by saying, we so appreciated your first gift in 2008 and every one of the 14, of the 35 gifts you've made since then. Here is your giving for the last 5 years. And they outlined individual giving, sponsorships, campaign gifts. And then at the bottom third was, here are the things that your giving has made possible. And they listed milestones and people served. And it was a one-page investment portfolio, just as though you were talking to someone about their stock investments, right?
Smart. Yeah.
Smart. So if you do that, Chuck, then you're looking at it all together, right? You're not sort of stumbling over each other, right? So then you are planning. The essence of what that is that then you are helping to plan donor by donor, not gift by gift, right? That forces you to shift your thinking so that, and to get on the donor side is like, last year you sponsored these two things and you made an annual fund gift and a campaign gift. What would you like to do next year?
Yes, you should ask together, right? So it needs to be coordinated, basically, and the way that Andrea has outlined it is a perfect way to coordinate these kinds of things. But you should be able to go to a donor once and say, listen, these are all the gifts you made last year. And we're hoping that you are able to do the same or, in addition, this, that, and the other thing this year. So you should be coordinating with the executive director and not, each going to your donors separately. It makes you look disorganized.
Right. Well, and I should say that even if you have one of these investment portfolio concepts. That doesn't mean that you can't go and ask them for individual asks during the year, but then you have a roadmap for it, and your donor has a roadmap for it. Your donor knows you're going to be coming to them for the golf tournament, the this, the that, and you have actually mapped that out in advance, but you still get the touches of soliciting them for the events, right? I'm not so much in favor of saying, okay, let's make a commitment to all 5 of these things now. But it's like, does this look like the way you want to do your giving this year? And we'll be happy to come to you as these come up in our calendar.
Well, you can ask the donor.
However they want to do it.
How do you want to be solicited?
Right.
Do you want to commit to all these things at once, or should we come back to you during each of this fundraising seasons?
That's right.
All right. Suzanne's asking, what is your feeling about board minimum gifts? We recently instituted a board minimum. This is a board that has never had a minimum, and we're trying to build a culture of philanthropy and attract new foundation donors. So it's too bad that you're asking after that you just instituted the board minimum, but it is what it is, right?
So here's the problem.
There's pros and cons. Yeah. There's pros and cons to board minimums, but what's the problem with it?
Well, a problem with it is that you probably want a board that is varied, right? That represents a wide variety of people, including some of the people that your organization might be serving, for example.
Well, she says there are exceptions for individuals with financial issues. So they've made exceptions for those folks on their board that can't give the minimum.
Yeah, I mean, my own preference is, I think, let me say, I think that it's a really good idea to be able to help board members understand what they might give. And the board minimum does help with that, right? So I don't want to totally negate it. It does help with that. If you know that every board member is, you would like every board member to give at least, I don't know, $2,500 or $25,000, whatever the number is for your board, that gives board members a number to consider. Now, in that is also the problem of it, because you might easily think that is what you should give. So if you have some board members who could give $100,000 every year, and you say that every board member has got to give $25,000, what do you think they're going to give? Right? The ceiling is going to be, the floor is going to become the ceiling.
Right. Yeah.
Which is the challenge of it. So a better strategy is to make clear what board giving patterns have been in the past, to do something to set a board giving goal for the collectively for the board, and to say that you would like board members both to give and to get, and that every board member should make a gift that is as generous as possible and in the top 3 gifts they make while they serve on the board, something like that.
Yeah. So Diane says in the comments, we have 12 board members, each giving $1,000. Now, my guess is that $1,000 is a real hardship for some of her board members, and easy for others. And so is it right that all 12 give exactly the same amount? No, probably not. You want some board members who maybe can't give that. And so what happens when you set a board minimum is that some board members fade away and go off the board. And they might be great board members, but they're alienated by that minimum because they can't possibly match it. And then other board members can easily write that check, but they could be giving many times that.
Yeah, so there's another interesting part of this, and I think we often think about this from a position of stinginess or something, that board members are, not wanting to give as generously as they might be able to. But I think it's interesting to think about it from the other way around, which is, let's say you have someone on your board who really does have significant wealth. Then that person knows that there's no one else on the board who has wealth like he or she has, right? It may well feel awkward to that person to give 10 times what the next board member gives. It may feel to them like everyone's going to think they're throwing their weight around. So you have to think about it from a position of social connections, right? That it's not that people want to be stingy. It's that they want to place themselves in a community of givers in a way that feels appropriate and okay.
Within the context of the organization.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So it's a complicated subject, actually.
All right. Christine, I think you may need to expand on this. Do you only mention both to those who are major prospects for the campaign? So both the campaign and yeah. Okay.
I think I would probably mention both to everybody, right? If somebody gives you $25 or $50 a year, you might say, just be aware, we're coming back to you a little later because we've got this exciting campaign, right? We hope you'll consider a second giver. And you don't have to elaborate, but you can.
Yeah, I think you want to mention both to everybody. I mean, by not, you're not giving them the opportunity to participate. You're making assumptions for them. You are, you're assuming that they can't or that they won't give to both projects. And you shouldn't do that. Any supporter that you have, you should tell them the full range of things that you're up to and that you're looking for support in all areas. All right. Celeste says, is there a certain proportion of capital campaign that should be raised through board donations? We do not have any major donors on our board. They all give every year, but some are quite small and large board members, probably not major campaign gifts.
Right. And the answer is that there is not one percentage. Now, some of my colleagues would disagree with me, so I need to keep saying that. I have such clear sounding opinions, and then it turns out other people don't agree with my clear sounding opinions.
Yeah.
But since you asked me, my opinion is that there is no percentage for exactly the reason that you bring up, Celeste, which is that your board is not made of major donors, right? You don't have people on your board. You don't think you have people on your board who could give really big gifts. So it makes no sense to say 20% of your campaign goal needs to come from your board, right? You have to look, of course, at the capacity and inclination of the people who are on your board. And then you have to give them an opportunity to help come up with a board giving goal for your campaign. You can say to them, ideally, we would like our board to be able to give at least 10% of the campaign goal. In order to make that work, you might want to include your campaign committee. You can say a leadership gift. We want leadership, which includes board, campaign committee, right?
You better backpedal because your campaign committee better be giving more than that, right?
Well, but you can look at it collectively is my point.
Yes.
My point is not that you should diminish. I mean, then you can say, well, between the board and the campaign committee, we have given 40%, 50% of our campaign goal. Right?
Yes.
So there are ways, if your board really has no capacity, right, there are ways of shifting that slightly. But I think your board will need to be in a conversation about what the board giving policies should be, what a board giving goals would be for your particular organization. And you actually might be surprised how much the board is able to give. I mean, my little Providence organization, which I bring up again and again, after some significant process to figure out, their board gave collectively more than $1 million to that campaign. I think everyone on the board was stunned.
And beforehand would have said that they could never do that.
That
they could never do that.
Right.
And I think that is the go-to assumption, is that the board can do less than ultimately they do. Right. That's what happens with every campaign. As the project gets big, it gets exciting, it's impactful, and everybody digs deep. So you might have board goals that are, of course, 100% participation, maybe very early, right? Within the first 2 months, we want 100% board participation. You might have some board goals around plan giving. So you can get really creative in terms of what your board goals might be. But, you want your board members to give early, to give first, to dig deep, to think creatively.
Right. It also is good to remember that it's wonderful to have a few board members who really can give significant gifts. So while that shouldn't be the only reason people serve on your board, it obviously should always be a lens through which you look at who might be a good next board member.
Yeah. I'm curious, for people who have been through this early stage of campaign fundraising, any comments that you want to make in the chat box about how you got your board members to participate and how you thought about a board goal, a percentage, or how it worked at your organization? If you can say it in a few words in the chat, we would love to hear from you. All right, let's go back to our questions here. I think this is a comment from Carol, not a question. Yes. Okay. Carol, if you had a question and I missed it, go ahead and type it back into the Q&A section. All right. Adrian says, how do you keep board members motivated to actually attend board meetings? Good question. How many meetings a year do you suggest? We're seeing a big decline in attendance at meetings. We know probably why that's happening. We could give it a good guess anyways. Could be a leftover issue from meeting via Zoom during COVID, but now meetings are in person. All right, excellent. So why do you think people don't attend meetings or stop attending meetings? I'm going to put it in 2 words, boring meetings, right?
I was just going to say
boring board meetings.
Boring. Right.
The chances are very high that your meetings are report outs. So they come and sit, they have no role except for to listen. And honestly, there's no reason for them to be there. That's my number one guess, is that you are not including everybody in the conversation of your board meeting. So figure out a way where board meetings turn into a conversation, a discussion that everybody is called on at least twice during the meeting so that there's actually a reason for them to be there. There's no reason. If you're just reading reports or giving reports, you could just email them to them ahead of time. And that's super boring. So I'd love to hear, Adrian, if that rings a bell. What would you add?
Yeah, the other thing, I like the idea of thinking about board meetings as giving back as much as they get, right? So what could you do that in every board meeting that would make it interesting for a board member? What could you do to have a program person, for example, come and talk about the newest theories of child education, COVID? Could you have an expert come from your community to talk about the problems that your community is facing and solutions? Can you piggyback on another organization and invite someone in? One of my favorite strategies that someone told me about years ago was that at every board meeting, you should get someone who's really interesting and maybe a leader in your community to come and spend 15 minutes talking to your board about something. And what happens, of course, is that then that person gets introduced to your organization, and your board members have a reason to come to meetings because the head of the university has come to talk to you about the latest in child education, or someone who's just written a book who happens to be in town will come. It takes a little doing to set it up, but the consequences both ways are significant, right? Board members will go to board meetings because they're going to learn something and meet someone they wouldn't meet otherwise. Mm-hmm. And the people who come are going to learn about your organization and may well open doors that you never thought you could open. So it's, I could imagine putting together a board program committee. It's not worried about reports, but is worried about, what's going to be fascinating for our board members? You can ask the board members, what topics are you interested in learning about? Let us have 15 minutes at every board meeting about being a learning process.
So I would love for everybody on the call to put in, the second part of the question was, how many board meetings? And Suzanne's written, we have reduced the number of board meetings from monthly to quarterly, and not make them about reports, but about strategic issues and high level thinking for moving the organization forward. Now, I think you probably swung too far the other way, Suzanne, from monthly to quarterly. So I like to see a board meeting every other month. And then on the alternate months, you have committee meetings, right? And the committees do the work of the board and then have the big level discussions at the board meetings. But the reality is, you should meet as frequently as there's meaningful and thoughtful material to discuss and issues to so that the board can function. Quarterly is probably the least. Monthly maybe is the most, and somewhere in between is probably right. So some people are saying three a year. That's probably too few. Your board members can't get to know each other only 3 times a year. If you miss one meeting or 2 meetings, you only show up for 1 or 2 meetings. You do want there to be a sense of collegiality. And so, if you're only meeting 3 or 4 times a year and somebody misses 1 or 2, what happens? All right. Barbara is asking, my boss believes that there should only be 1 ask item per ask, like annual appeal letters, but you seem to be saying more than 1 ask can be in a letter, appeal ask and a bequest ask. You can be asking for one thing and mention the other thing. You can ask for annual fund and say, stay tuned, our campaign is coming. Or if you'd like to learn more about making a bequest, let us know. So, in person, face to face, you can probably ask for more than one thing. You're probably right. In a written appeal, it probably makes sense to ask for one thing, but then you can reference other things.
So I want to say that you will know that your approaches to making board meetings exciting are working when your board members, first of all, when your board members want to meet more. That's number one. And second of all, when more and more people want to join your board, when word gets out that it's exciting, then lo and behold, you're going to find that you're having to pick through people who want to join your board because it will be the place to be. So it's actually it's important that you do it well, right? If you do it well, there are major upside consequences. So, my little Providence client, I know that the campaign committees are successful. So how do I know? Because none of them want to go away. It's like
they don't want the campaign to end.
None of them want, it's like, well, this task is over, so we don't really need to meet. Well, they all wanted to be on whatever committee was coming next. They didn't want to go away.
Right. Well,
that's a good sign of success.
They like each other. They enjoy coming together. They find the work valuable and meaningful and important.
And these were all Zoom. They liked it.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
All right. Michelle's asking, do you like this investment portfolio option for the development director? Absolutely. I mean, I'm not sure why it would be different from the development director. It can be used by whoever's doing the asking, whoever's having the conversation with the donors should share the history, their giving history. Hopefully your records are up to date.
Yeah, the ideal is to have a format for it, and then everyone who gives over a certain amount has an investment portfolio, an investment report, I suppose. It's not a portfolio, it's an investment report.
Yeah. All right, good. You want to read the next one?
How does community-centric fundraising as opposed to donor-centric fundraising fit with capital campaigns? Well, Diana, that is a question we have thought about and continue to think about a lot. It's a really important question. And the challenge of it, of course, is that capital campaigns are the most capitalistic, if you will, form of fundraising. They rely on a relatively few very large gifts. And many of the donors who can give those gifts, though not all, but many of them are people who are white men, sometimes white women, but it tends not to be a very inclusive group of people when we look at it through any other lens. So the question we've asked ourselves is, that's our business, right? That very capitalistic, non-inclusive way of fundraising is the business that we're in. And the answer that we keep working on is this, that the capital campaign strategies are really powerful and effective strategies, right? They work because they reflect things about human nature that have been tested through many years and decades and centuries. And we know and we understand them as efficient, effective ways to raise money. So we think that our role in in community-centric fundraising is this, that we want to be able to work with and help organizations from all across the culture be able to understand and use the kind of fundraising we know how to do. Right, that we want to empower people by imparting that kind of information. Right?
So our role is to bring this kind of fundraising to all communities, to all organizations, and honestly, that's why one of the many reasons we set up the Capital Campaign Toolkit the way it is, because it's very equitable. Our services are provided at the same charge, at the same level, whether you're raising $1 million or $100 million, whether you're at a big organization or a small organization, or a new organization or established organization. And so we're bringing these capital campaign concepts to the masses, basically. And so I think that we see that as our role in being more.
Right. The other area that we work on and think about a lot is the question of donor recognition. And, in many capital campaigns that are building campaigns in particular, there are practices for naming pieces of buildings in honor of the people who could give the most money. And we really are actively calling that into question, because it's one thing to have people who have a great deal of wealth give to an organization to try to help support their mission. It's quite another thing to indicate that somehow they own the organization or they can drive the agenda of the organization. So we want to be calling into question the various practices of donor recognition, that as they reflect the values that we believe are important in the society.
All right, good. Good question. Keep asking those types of questions. Keep pushing us on them. We're continually trying to think of how to incorporate more DEI issues into capital campaigns. All right. Carol's asking about it's a follow-up question to the operating endowment. The board believes that there should be a line for operating within the capital campaign.
Yeah. So this is, there are campaigns that do that. They're called comprehensive campaigns. Colleges and universities do that all the time, right? They take however many years the campaign is going to go on and people can pledge to the campaign. They add that many years of annual fundraising and they increase their goal accordingly. So it is a perfectly appropriate model. It's not a model we happen to like, because it makes everything cloudy, in our opinion. Again, there are many consultants who totally believe in that, who will really push that. I think largely it comes from whether your experience is out of the university model, where people want to include all alumni giving in the campaign. That's why they do it, right? They want to use the campaign to boost alumni giving. But we find that for community-based organizations, for other simpler kinds of organizations, being clear and keeping an annual goal, an annual fundraising goal, and a separate campaign goal is just a clearer, simpler strategy. But there's nothing wrong with the other. It's appropriate.
And Carol, you're using the words operating endowment. And so I just want to make sure that we're using the same terminology. I'm not sure what you mean by operating endowment. So most people are asking, should endowment be a component of a campaign? And the answer is usually yes, one component, not a capital campaign that's only raising money for endowment, but maybe a campaign would include a goal of having 10 new bequest intentions, just making sure that everybody remembers that endowment money is primarily raised through planned gifts and bequests. But a campaign is an opportunity to talk about long-term stability for an organization. And so, of course, you'd be raising some money for your endowment as well.
That was funny, Amy. I focused on operating and you focused on endowment. So we got both sides of that for you.
Hopefully. Right. All right, good. A couple more minutes and a couple more questions. Rob's asking, the challenge for our board meetings is we have so much to report out and update the board on that it can be hard to add a presentation with a real discussion. Also think this year there's a lot of Zoom fatigue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Stop. Right. So you can't tell me on one hand, now I'm not saying you said this, Rob, but just looking at the broader conversation, that you have too much for your board meetings. So we're going to have fewer board meetings, right? Now, I know you haven't said that in your question, but that just makes me laugh because people are saying, well, we're going to have fewer board meetings. And you're saying we have so much to report. How can we add something else? So you can do a variety of things. So first of all, anything that is report format, you should send reports in advance, right? You don't want people giving long, boring reports. It's like, who the hell wants to hear a report? Do a report, then have questions and discussions of key issues in the report. But don't give report after report. It's deadly. So handle that a different way. If you need more time, you can lengthen your board meeting or you can have additional board meeting. I don't believe in Zoom fatigue, honestly. I think Zoom is used well. It is a remarkably efficient and effective way of having meetings. And I find that people like it. They don't like schlepping to meetings. They don't like having to park their cars.
Here's where Zoom fatigue gets in. If you expect people to sit there and watch other people report, of course I'm going to be fatigued.
Exactly.
Yes. But if you say, okay, we tell them in advance, we're going to send the reports out this month or this quarter, whatever. And we expect you to read them because we're going to be having a discussion of the information in them, but we're not going to be reading them in the meeting. Instead, we're going to call on every single person. We're going to go around at the beginning of the meeting. We're going to ask some interesting question that everybody can participate on. And before we wrap up the meeting, we're going to go around again. So they're not going to be fatigued if they're participating. They're fatigued by just sitting back and being expected to watch and listen. Of course, that would be boring to anybody. So
you need to rethink your board meetings a little, Rob.
All right. One more question before we wrap up for the day. I think we've got a question from Amy that says, do you have any advice for re-engaging lapsed donors through a capital campaign?
Yes. So lapsed donors are interesting, sometimes very interesting, actually. I think often what happens is that when people are lapsed, and this is true of board members also, board members who have dropped off, that we tend to sort of stop being personal with them, right? We tend to send them things that are impersonal because we feel a little injured because they dropped off, right? So it makes it less easy to be wondering what's going on with them and how they are, right?
I think that, there's many reasons that donors lapse, right? That they stop giving. And the question is, do you know why? Do you know why they stopped? So for a capital campaign, for some of these big donors, let's say you had a capital campaign 10 years ago and you had some lead donors to the campaign and they haven't given recently. Well, I would say that either they got annoyed at someone or something that happened at the organization. Frequently that happens, right? The organization goes in one direction or somebody said something in a board meeting and ticked them off. And they're somehow ticked off at the organization and they went on their merry way and nobody did anything to try and remedy the situation or even to be good listeners. Sometimes you can't remedy the situation, but if you really just sit down with the donor and say, listen, we see that you were really frustrated or that was really upsetting, or I wasn't here 5 years ago. I see you made this huge gift to the organization, but you haven't been around for a while. Tell me about that history. What happened? What's going on? Right? What did you hope to see at the organization? So, there's some people that are really big donors and then they go away. And the question is why? Other times, if you're talking about people who have given once or twice through the annual fund and they don't give again, are they going to come back for a capital campaign? Maybe, maybe not. Are you really going to worry about them? You're going to manage them in a slightly different way. Some people do come back for an exciting big project, but to me, the way to engage big donors, big potential donors, is to sit down and ask them, tell me about your giving to this organization in the past and tell me, why aren't you involved in anymore? Did something happen or, what's going on? So
I think that's the perfect answer, Amy.
Excellent. I always love ending on a perfect answer, right?
Yes.
All right. Listen, guys, it has been great. We are super excited to be coming to you together in the same room.
It's so rare.
In the same state, right? And we will see you next week. Please do continue to send us your questions. We love seeing them and seeing you each and every week. It's the highlight of our day and our week.
Excellent. Okay, everybody. Thanks so much. Bye,
guys.
We'll see you next week.
Thanks for joining Amy and Andrea for today's All About Capital Campaigns. To learn more about them and their work together, go to capitalcampaigntoolkit.com.